Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, chapter 7, halacha 5, in the Art Scroll 65b2, and this is very, very short. Now, we're going to talk about the case of a grapevine going over grain. But again, the idea that's coming up here is, hey, if I'm not trying to do it, if something happens accidentally, am I still liable for maintaining Kilayim? That's the idea. The Mishnah starts and says, if wind cracked grapevines, in other words, that it didn't sever the grapevine, but it bent it over and it cracked it, and it like broke the branch, but it didn't separate. It's still attached from the ground. And now the idea is that it caused these cracks caused them to lean over standing grain, says the Mishnah. It says that he immediately must cut the vines so that they no longer lean over the grain. In other words, it's talking about an accident, or it's talking about something that you didn't plan. It was the wind. The wind did it. You didn't do it. What happens now? Not a person actually went and sowed it, but now, are you maintaining it? That's the issue. You didn't actually make it. There's two things, right? There's sowing it this way or planting it this way. That's a kavanah thing, and that's attention. And then also, there's going to be where there's maintaining it and willful maintenance. And so even if you have something that accidentally happened to put it into a state of Kilayim, what about maintaining it? So that's why you have to cut it, to make sure you're not maintaining it. So the next part of the Mishnah says, if an accident befell him that prevented him from cutting the vines, then the vines and the grains are still permitted for benefit. Again, there's something that came up where, his wife had to go to the hospital, and he had to take his wife to the hospital, and he couldn't go, cut back the Kilayim vines. Is he liable still? The answer is no, because it's not willful. Okay? The idea is that you always want to think about Kilayim and say, oh, am I willfully maintaining Kilayim? And this is a case where something prevented you from doing it. So did you nullify the use of your vines and your grain? No, you can go out and you can cut it, or you can harvest it to make sure that you're not maintaining it. Now, regarding the next part, it says regarding standing grain that leans under a vine, and likewise regarding vegetables that lean under a vine, he must turn the grain or the vegetables away from beneath the vine. In other words, you have to move the vine and make sure that it's not over your stuff. And the Mishnah continues and says the overhanging vine does not render the grain or vegetables prohibited, even if they were turned back. And this is, says Rosh Cirilio, only when the primary part of the grain plant and the stalk is going to be underneath the overhanging grapevine branch, and then that's going to be where Kilayim is prohibited. So in the case of the Mishnah, where the grain or the vegetables emerge from the ground elsewhere, and only then are the upper parts underneath the grapevine are going to be Kilayim and not rendered prohibited. And as you can hear, my son Aaron Yudalei ben Edna is helping to learn the Gemara. He's 1 year old, and he's here listening to the shiur, and he gets benefit for it too. And you get the mitzvah of, I get the mitzvah of teaching my kid Torah, and very important to do. So the next part, the Mishnah turns to the question about when, at what point, what's the earliest stage when grain or even grapes are going to be subject to becoming prohibited as kalei karam. So in other words, when is this kalei karam? And the Mishnah says from when the development of grain is rendered prohibited as kalei karam. That's a question. Answer is from when the kernels reach a third of their full size. What does that mean? It's not when the plant reaches a third of the size. It's when the kernels reach a third of their size. We learned this in Shvius and in Demai. That's when these plants become viable. In other words, that's when you can take a grain plant and plant a new one to propagate it. And before that, if you planted immature grain in the ground, it would just rot. But at 1/3 growth or readiness, it can still make a new grain plant. That's when it also, by the way, is liable for tithing. So over here, just like it's liable for tithing, just like biologically it's liable to make new grain plants. Over here, that's when it's prohibited as Kilayim. And from when are grapes going to be have enough development to be rendered prohibited? When they become the size of a white bean. And this, by the way, is when they're going to be having the status when you can also do for tithing. So the critical stage didn't come yet. It's certainly not going to be what you ideally want to eat. But can you even use this for food things? Yes, you can. In fact, the immature grapes can be used to make vinegar and things like that. So the Mishnah gives the stages of development beyond which grain and grapes are no longer subject to becoming prohibited as Kilayim. And the Mishnah says that grain that has fully ripened and dried out to its full extent, and grapes that have ripened to their full extent and are ready for harvested, cannot be rendered prohibited. So the idea is that it's pulling from the verse in Beurim 22:9, and the idea is that it says over there, "You shall not sow your vineyard, Kilayim, lest the fullness of your seed you sow becomes forbidden, and the produce of the vineyard." And this is teaching that Kilayim becomes prohibited only when the fullness of the seed and the produce of the vineyard grow together. And the Mishnah is teaching that this refers to grain and grapes only when they're at the growing stage. And once they've completely developed and they're ready, Marafulda says that they're not referred to by these terms anymore. Instead, they're termed as wheat and grapes. Therefore, if the vineyard whose grapes have already fully developed, or one plants a vine of among grain that's completely ripe, neither is prohibited. That's the idea, and the Rambam also holds that opinion. The Chazan Ish holds that opinion. So that's the idea. So the Gemara is going to start and says, but according to Ben Azai, he must trim the vegetables. In other words, the Mishnah that's talking about the grain and the vegetables leaning under a vine, that they have to be turned away, and there's a dissenting opinion, and it's between Ben Azai and Rabbi Akiva. Ben Azai used to be the student of Rabbi Akiva, and then he became his equal, and in many cases, the halacha between a dispute between Ben Azai and Rabbi Akiva is going to go by Ben Azai. So, and Ben Azai was so sharp that many times Rabbi Akiva actually says that I concede to you. So the Gemara says, according to Ben Azai, he must trim the vegetables and cut off the parts that extend beneath the vine, and it's not enough just to direct them away from beneath the vine. And the Gemara says that there was a brisa that was found to have taught that the remaining vegetables leaning under a vine, and Rabbi Akiva says that he turns them back from under the vine. And the counter, again, by Ben Azai, says he must actually trim them. So the Rosh Cirilio says that Ben Azai is holding that although the grain leaning under a grapevine has to be turned back, the vegetables must be trimmed. Now, there's a difference between the grain and the vegetables, and vegetables are going to be small and thin. So if you just turn them back, they might lean under the vine again, and you might not even notice it. So that's why you have to trim it. And the Mishnah is going to follow Rabbi Akiva's position, but as we're seeing here, it's gonna be by Ben Azai when you're actually putting Rabbi Akiva's position up against Ben Azai. So the Mishnah goes to the next part. The Gemara goes to the next part of the Mishnah, where it's talking about from when is the development of grain to start to be rendered prohibited. It's Kilayim, and that's going to be where it's going to be 1/3 growth for their size. And again, that's going to be also from when they're tithing, when you start to tithe grain. And the Gemara says that there was a teacher, Brysos, who teaches our Mishnah as ruling that grain is able to be rendered prohibited from when it takes root at the ground. So this also comes up in Masechet Shvius. Is something going to become prohibited when it takes root, or is it going to be when it actually grows? And this comes up when we're dealing with the laws for, say, rice. Rice is going to be where it takes root in the ground, but for wheat is going to be where it's 1/3 ripe. And that's going to be also for the laws of Shvius. So in chapter 5 of the Mishnah, in 5:6, is talking about a case when wind planted grain in a vineyard or a field. In other words, you're throwing up the grain to sow it and trying to sprinkle it, and some of it blows into a vineyard, and what's going to be the law there. And the idea is that it has to be turned over in some cases. And the Gemara there is going to be a maloka between Rabbi Hoshaya and Rabbi Yochanan. And Rabbi Hoshaya is going to be saying that the grass is going to be turned over and you uproot it and prevent any further growth of Kilayim. And it's permitted for benefit, though. That's the wrinkle. Rabbi Yochanan says that in the Mishnah talking about that, when you're doing this windblown wheat into the vineyard, that what the Mishnah means is that it is prohibited for benefit. So that's the opposite of Rabbi Hoshaya. And that it also has to be destroyed, and you can't just leave it to rot. So the Gemara here gets back to the maloket again between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Hoshaya. So the one who says that the correct reading of that Mishnah over there in 5:6, Kilayim 5:6, is that the grain becomes prohibited when it takes root in the ground. That's going to be the position of Rabbi Yochanan. And the one who says that the correct reading is for when kernels reach a third of their size supports the position of Rabbi Hoshaya. And again, when we're talking about for harvesting, and we're talking about is this produce going to be 7th year produce or 8th year produce? Is this produce going to be 6th year produce or 7th year produce? So we're also going to be looking at for wheat. We're going to look at for wheat when does the grain reach 1/3, but for rice we're going to be looking at when does it take root. And over here he's saying for Kilayim it's going to be when it takes root. So it's not going to be used to determine which year it is, but it is in this case going to be there to determine was it Kilayim or not. So it's a little bit different. Cases are similar but different. So the next case with Rabbi Hoshaya says the one who says that the correct readings from when the kernels reach 1/3 of their size supports the position of Rabbi Hoshaya. So the idea is that, when we're talking about grain becoming prohibited as kalei karam, it's from when it takes root, and the version that supports Rabbi Yochanan's ruling is going to be the halacha l'maisa, because in a maloket between Rabbi Hoshaya and Rabbi Yochanan, it's going to go by Rabbi Yochanan. And the Mishnah stated that grapes are going to be subject to being rendered prohibited from when they become the size of a white bean. And how do we know this in Scripture? And they're going to give an asmata to it. Rabbi Hanania, the son of Rabbi Hillel, says that this is derived from that which is written regarding Kalei Karam in Beurim 22:9. It says, lest the fullness of the seed you sow becomes forbidden in the produce of the vineyard. In other words, since grapes are not considered the produce of a vineyard until it reaches the size of a white bean, they can't be prohibited as Kalei Karam until they're at that stage in development. And Rabbi Kanievsky says in many areas of halacha, grapes are considered to be fruit when they reach the size of a white bean. And that's a very good point. So the Mishnah concludes, and the Gemara says that grain that is ripened fully and dries, and in other words, it goes to where even the grapes are ready for harvest now. And the Gemara says that this is all the Mishnah means. The Gemara says that they cannot be rendered prohibited for benefit by being sown as Kilayim, but there is, however, a prohibition to sow such Kilayim in the first place, even if the grapes or the grain has ripened completely. So the idea is that even though you're not allowed to sow it that way, and it's unclear whether in that case it would be biblically forbidden or rabbinically forbidden, but the case is that you can't do it. But did you forbid the fully ripened grapes or the fully ripened grain? You did not, but you're not allowed to sow Kilayim next to it. That's the idea. And in chapter 7, halacha 6, we're going to get into all of the details about Kilayim and flower pots. Have a great day.